Hear me?
Yes.
I'm very happy to welcome you today at our mini-symposium dedicated to culturally responsive leadership and evaluation in schools. Just a few words. Today we will have speakers from 3 countries, Ireland, Austria, and Russia. They will present the Erasmus Plus project, Culturally Responsive Leadership and Evaluation in Schools, and will explain what stages the project had and what are the interim results of the project. And I remind our listeners that they can ask their questions both in English and Russian. And for those who listen in Russian, please join the channel with simultaneous interpreting into Russian. And I think that we can start with our first presentation. Martin, will you please start with the outline of the project?
Yeah, I will. Thanks very much, Natalia, for the introduction, and also to our colleagues in MCU for organising this symposium. So I'm just going to briefly, my name is Martin Brown, and I am the project coordinator for the Erasmus Plus project entitled Culturally Responsive Evaluation and Leadership in Schools. And the project is a 3-year project that started in 2000, roughly around 2 years ago now. And it relates to this whole conceptualization of putting in place mechanisms and supports to enhance parity of equity for migration background students. There are a number of colleagues from various countries and jurisdictions on the project, as listed here, from Johannes Kepler University in Linz, and they'll introduce themselves later on, from the University of Innsbruck, from the University of Salamanca, and of course, ourselves from Dublin City University, EQY, and most certainly, not last but not least, they are our colleagues from Moscow City University, who are all partners. And indeed, as you'll see, all of the names, there are multiple academics and colleagues on the actual project. So why are we doing this project, and what are we trying to do? Well, most of you might be aware that although there are many positive aspects and supports and mechanisms that have been put in place by transnational organizations and indeed national organizations, the reality, unfortunately, is that there still seems to be, in most jurisdictions, whether it is in relation to internal migration or external migration, a number of issues that relate to what we might refer to as cultural neglect. So, for example, our colleague Barbara Herzog-Punzenberger and colleagues, and Herbert Altrichter, have clearly outlined in previous research that there are lack of strategies relating to what might be referred to as linguistic interdependence. Our own research in Ireland and other jurisdictions, there is a lack of culturally responsive leadership. And indeed, there is a lack of understanding relation to what might be referred to as test design and the implications for policy reform. There is also other issues involved, for example, policy enactment on the one hand and policy implementation on the other. So, and this comes true if, although sometimes there are criticisms of transnational testing regimes, but the reality is, if you look at all of these test scores in most jurisdictions, regardless of the actual size of the actual population, or indeed the cultural makeup, students tend to perform worse from migration background in comparison to their native peers, as illustrated in the actual PISA test scores as they exist. So there's a statement, and it's an oft-used statement, and relates to the call for cultural responsivity has reached what might be referred to as a deafening crescendo. So briefly, what we're trying to do collectively and the whole academic community is trying to actually create what are referred to as culturally responsive learning environments. And culturally responsive learning environments, it's a very broad brushstroke term, and it encompasses and engenders masses of aspects of education, such as, and I'm not going to list them all now because my colleagues will talk about them later on, such as philosophy, curriculum, instruction, assessment, and indeed learning environments. Collectively, what also needs to be actually looked at is this whole notion of bringing all of these aspects of cultural responsivity together through a leadership lens. So very few studies in Europe and indeed elsewhere in comparison to culturally responsive evaluation, culturally responsive assessment, etc., have actually looked at this notion of how leaders can play a part in leading all of this. So in that regard, what we have decided to do was to develop this project. And again, I've listed the universities from DCU, Johannes Kepler University, Moscow State University, etc. So we have a project website as well, prelis.eu. It's multilingual as well, translated into Russian, Spanish, Dutch, and indeed is in English. So, what are we doing more specifically? Using a collaborative approach, we have indeed, and we endeavour to develop conceptual framework of best practice in education and leadership, which our colleagues Herbert Altrichter and Barbara Herzog-Punzenberger will talk about later on.
Об этом я поговорю немножечко позже. Для меньшинств студенческих это формирует своего рода базис для развития возможностей и открытых курсов. Поэтому наши основные задачи заключаются в том, чтобы систематически и всеобъемлюще рассмотреть
students. We've completed this and the publication is out next week. Dissemination of our results through our website led by our colleagues from Spain. School-based surveys, which our colleagues from MCU will talk about later on, of hindering and facilitating factors for culturally responsive leadership. And indeed is about to be presented now, the creation of a conceptual framework of best practice for culturally responsive leadership by our colleagues from Austria, multimodal case studies of culturally responsive leadership, also led by our colleagues from Austria. And in our final year, we only have approximately 12 months left in the project to get all of this information and to present it as an open access, what might be referred to as MOOC, open access online training environment, an auditing toolkit for schools and policy makers. So in brief, our colleagues now are going to present a conceptual framework for culturally responsive leadership in schools, followed by a comparative analysis of culturally responsive practices from our colleagues from Russia, and then hopefully most significantly for those that are there with the limitations of translations and time, we hope to actually have a deep, rich discussion of our findings. So in that regard, and I told my colleagues that I keep to 10 minutes, I'm going to pass it over to the chair, Natalia, who's going to introduce our next guests.
Thank you very much, Martin, for this concise outline of the project. And I'm happy to turn the floor over to Herbert Altrichter from Johannes Kepler University and Barbara Herzog-Punzenberger from University of Innsbruck. Please welcome.
Yeah, welcome and good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Didn't work immediately. Let me welcome you and say good morning and introduce ourselves. This presentation will be by Barbara Herzog-Punzenberger from University of Innsbruck. Barbara, do you want to say hello?
Hello. Hello.
Okay, and myself, I'm Herbert Altrichter from University of Linz, Johannes Kepler University. And our task is to present you a part of this Graylis project, the conceptual framework. And now I'm wondering how to go on. Now, yes. Okay, what we are presenting to you is the conceptual framework. You heard something about the background of the project by Martin, so I need not extend on that. The only thing is maybe that it is worthwhile to be said that migration is not really a new phenomenon in many European countries, although we feel at the moment that this has new dimensions and new dimensions of diversity are here, but it's not really new. But maybe it's in some sense new for schools to find new ways of coping with it. And there were the idea to cope on the level of classroom teaching. We had a project before on classroom assessment and diversity. And in this project, we try to turn to leadership. As Martin has told you, he has told you about the guiding idea. And I only want to say some words about how we went about this part of the project, this part of developing a conceptual framework. There were two leading questions, basically how school leadership can contribute to culture and the practice of cultural responsibility in schools, and what the contextual and in-school variables which contribute to cultural responsibility in schools are. What we were doing was a systematic literature review. We turned in the first step to literature in English language from 2000 to 2020. We only took into account peer-reviewed articles, books, and doctoral theses, the library on online research. And you see the key terms in the last line, the key terms we used for our literature research. We examined the abstracts to find articles for closer inspection, and in the end we had 134 research articles which we selected for the final analysis. And what came out was, in the beginning, in the first step, literature review of English literature, and this being an international European project. In the second step, we asked all the countries which were contributing. You might remember that it's Spain, Russia, Ireland, and Austria, to complement the English literature review by relevant studies from their countries. What we in the end came up with were 7 conceptual fields which are responsive, which are relevant in our view for coping with the task of researching into culturally responsive leadership. And you will understand it's too much to explain all these 7 fields to you now in this short time. So Barbara will concentrate on just a few of the findings to put to discussion for you. But the full paper is basically finished. It is available, and should you be interested, please let us know. And it is available to all other researchers. So, Barbara, can I ask you to turn to your part?
Yes, and sorry, will you manipulate the PowerPoint slides? Yes, thank you. So I'm presenting to you the core concept of cultural responsivity, which is, of course, culture. And we will share the view, I guess, that there are different aspects of culture. What we find in the literature, we can speak about the material, the social, the subjective aspects of culture, as, for example, food, clothing, tools, music, institutions such as the family, the concept of the family, conventions such as politeness, languages, religions, etc. And then on the individual level, the subjective aspects about beliefs, values, the discourses that individuals take part, and the practices they exercise. So next slide, please. It is not only culture which is at the core of cultural responsivity in learning environments, but it is strongly connected to identity and belonging. This is what it is all about, I would say. To work towards a culturally responsive environment, necessarily the first step is to think through the concept of culture, identity, and belonging. You need to have a constructivist understanding of culture and identity. In the literature, it's very clearly argued that culture is understood as a fluid concept, as is identity. It's not static, it's changing all the time. Why is it changing? Because it is about interaction between humans, between individuals. And every interaction is, so to say, a kind of a mini negotiation of identity. So the mindful identity negotiation, there is a theory for that, is at the core. You always have to reflect yourself and your positioning in terms of identity and of the other persons interacting with you. So in every situation, it's slightly different. It's changing, it's open, it's fluid. And therefore, it is also open for instrumentalization. And this is an important part, I think, when we talk about societies and the opportunities of cultural responsivity in schools. How is identity, cultural identity, ethnic identity, religious identity instrumentalized? Because that makes a big difference for school leaders also, what they can do. Culture obviously is very heterogeneous inside. Oftentimes when we speak about other cultures, we think about a monolithic picture, how this and that culture is. But in fact, every culture is very heterogeneous inside. When we think about the social milieus inside every culture, every country, there are huge differences along socioeconomic lines, for example. Then part of this, there are a lot of ambiguities and contradictions when we think about our own culture, cultural identity, and think about the different groups in society and their struggles and their power struggles. That is these contradictions and ambiguities. And then when we think about the pupils, especially the pupils with migration background, they have obviously a hybrid identity because they can take elements from their parents' culture, from what they inherit, and they take up, of course, many elements of the present culture that is their environment or the cultures in plural, so to say. And what is probably also a core concept for this whole idea is belonging. It is an existential need for every human being to belong to the groups it is part of, to feel the belonging, to feel, to be part of this group in the classroom, in the school. And so that has the important message here is it need not be dependent on ethnic, religious, linguistic features of the pupil. That is the concept of culture. And here again, some foundational authors and texts already Martin has mentioned some, just to show you that this discourse is, well, it started at least in the beginning of the 1990s, but in some countries, I would say also in Austria, it's only slowly reaching the general discourse. So this is a process. Next slide, please. So we have surveyed the literature, the discourse, and found quite interesting concepts, how it is used already also, cultural responsivity. And here is one outcome where all the teaching standards of the states in the United States, about, I think it was mentioned in about 50 states teaching standards, they were collected here, and it is described what are the 8 important competencies for culturally responsive teaching. I will go through it very quickly. To begin with, to reflect on one's cultural lens. That is, the teachers in the school leader has to be aware of the influence her own identity, being part of identity groups such as sexual orientation, gender, socioeconomic background, religion, language, influences very strongly how he or she views the school community, the pupils, etc. Herbert? Yes. The second one is to recognize and redress bias in the system. It's not only to be aware of discrimination, racism, and so on at the personal level, at the individual level, but also at the system level. So that is how the resources are channeled towards different schools and according to oftentimes socioeconomic background, ethnic background of the school pupils, of the school composition. Very important to draw on students' culture to shape curriculum and instruction. That means that you know a lot about their life worlds. Bring real world issues into the classroom so that they feel that what they learn can be part of bringing about the solution for themselves and for their community. Model high expectations for all students, most important. This is an outcome of research, very important because we have had these effects of different expectations of the teachers for different ethnic groups and so on. Promote respect for student differences, that is obvious. Collaborate with families and the local community, very dependent on how the school system, so to say, treats this collaboration. We can speak about that afterwards. And communicate in linguistically and culturally responsive ways. Next slide, please. Here's another image. I will drop this because it's too much for the time, so that we can talk about culturally responsive school leadership as conceptualized, for example, by Khalifa, who put out the first book really on that topic only recently. He starts with 3 basic premises. Cultural responsive school leadership. Cultural responsivity is a necessary component of effective school leadership as such. Second, for cultural responsivity to be sustainable, school leaders must consistently promote it. That is not a one-time project, but a consistent strategy. Third, culturally responsive school leadership is characterized by a core set of leadership behaviors that is critically self-reflectiveness, which I've spoken before already. Developing and sustaining culturally responsive teachers and curricula. So the personnel, build up the personnel. Promoting inclusive, anti-oppressive school contexts and engaging students' community neighborhood contexts. So we turn now to the contextual factors. Of course, the societal and organizational factors influence school leaders' activities and their subsequent impact in all fields and strategies, also in cultural responsivity. So the question is, what are the general attitudes towards cultural diversity in society anyways? What are the main characteristics of the school system? For example, how selective along ability, socioeconomic background, and so is it? How inclusive? How centrally guided this is versus regional guided, or a big kind of school autonomy? The next point, what are national or regional policies regarding cultural responsivity? Is there any strategy or nothing? how are the support systems, which is of course interlinked with the policies that allow additional resource persons, time, material? Are there organizations that support very focused this strategy? What are the opportunities for relevant staff development? And last but not least, supranational policies like the European Union policies towards cultural responsibility and diversity, the UNESCO and others. And now our last slide to talk about hindering and facilitating factors. It is about the discourse, the general discourse. What is the system level discourse? What is the professional discourse? How do teacher unions define a professional image of teachers and school leaders? Is this cultural responsibility part of the professional understanding of this group of professions, or is it not an important topic? What are the policies and practices? Also at the system level, the personnel, administrative personnel who decide on data, on resources, what is their conviction concerning cultural diversity and responsibility? How do pre-service teacher education programs include this cultural responsibility? How do they include it in their attracting and selecting teacher students? Because we know that it is important that the diversity of the teacher staff, the school leader staff, is increasing. And how are school leaders prepared towards diversity? Last but not least, how are school leaders selected to increase school leader staff? Thank you. That, I think, is our last slide, Herbert. Thank you.
Turn over to Natalia. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Barbara and Herbert, for presenting the conceptual framework of the project. And the next stage of the research to be discussed is the actual survey of culturally responsive practices in schools of Ireland, Austria, Spain, and Russia. And presenting this part will be me and Daria Milyaeva and Igor Shiyan. Just a moment, and I will download the presentation. Can you see it?
Yes.
Okay, just. Okay, can you see it full screen?
Yes, it is full screen.
Thank you. Well, after we analyzed the literature dedicated to cultural responsivity and drawn the conceptual framework, the next practically oriented stage of the research was the actual survey of school practices. What we were interested in was how schools and school leaders' characteristics are connected with the culturally responsive practices that are carried out in schools. So the survey that we developed consisted of 4 sections. Each of the sections was dedicated to some part of the school profile. The first one, was to obtain data about school characteristics. The second part about school leaders. The third part about actual leadership in various environments. And the final part was about the challenges and supports of cultural responsivity in schools. The survey consisted of multiple choice and open-ended questions. And here you can see the stages of the survey that we conducted. So after developing the actual questions, we translated them into the local languages of the 4 countries. We created online versions of the survey. Each country used the platform that was most convenient for them. For example, here in Russia, we also had to obtain support from Moscow's educational authorities to distribute the survey on the city level, at the city level. And after distributing the survey around schools, we also had to do several iterations of reminding and to obtain the largest data that we could. Here you can see, the way the data looked when we obtained it via online platforms were used. Here in Moscow, we used Microsoft Forms and Google Forms. And here you can see it's actually in Russian, well, because the survey was distributed in Russian. Some preliminary data analytics. And this is from Microsoft Forms. Speaking of the results obtained, the number of responses was a little bit different in different countries due to, well, actually the most difficult part was that we distributed it at the very COVID lockdown, when principals had extra pressure due to lots of responsibilities. So the total number of responses that we received from all countries was 337. And you can see the distribution on the slide. Well, after we obtained the data and made some data processing, we actually had to encode it to be able to do some statistical analysis. So these stages included actual data encoding, and then we ran a number of tests, which my colleague Daria will explain in more detail in the next slides. Daria, could you please?
Yes, please.
Yes,
Hello, colleagues. Thank you, Natalia. I will continue. And after the survey was finished, we encoded the data and created, started classical analysis. So the first step was the consistency test you could see on the slide. And the surface of the rectangles shows the number of answers corresponding to each value. And the range of colors show transient deviations. The next slide, please. And so here, the rectangles are gray because we don't have high and low numbers as they had at the previous slide. The next one, please. As we were interested in how the schools and the school leaders' characteristics are connected with the cultural responsible leadership practices carried out in schools, we compared these practices with characteristics. In the survey, we have questions 18 and 19. That includes 18 cultural responsible leadership practices. Here you could see several of them. And during next slides, I will talk about these questions. The next one, please. Next step we did was factor analysis. It shows us that the first component describes only 10 to 15% of the variance, which is not efficient in terms of composition. The next slide, please. This is why, in addition to the factor analysis, we conducted a principal component analysis. Here you see the principal component analysis for island question 18. We used the principal component analysis method for the variables from question 18 and 19 united into a singular data set. And the correlation ratio between the sum of all values of the united variables from question 18 and 19 and PCA1 is close to 1, which allows us to use the sum of the variables as an adequate parameter that reflects the cumulative weight of each variable. The next one, please. Here you could see the correlations that we have found. We calculated correlation between each variable. We had about 111 variables from all questions, and the sum of the variables for questions 18 and 19. Then we selected correlation with the significant ratios and calculated linear regressions for all significant variables to find the trends. I will not talk about the group 1 because the correlation was not high. I will just mention group 1 because the interesting trend that we have found that the connection of participation of school leaders in practice in culture responsive leadership seminars and in networks of schools and their attitude to the student from the migrant background was connected with the cultural responsible practices that the schools realize. But the strongest correlation we found in the group 3, and I will stop there. Next slide, please. And I will tell more about the correlation that we have found and show the linear regressions for this group. The next slide, please. You could see the question 20.6. How often do parents of migrant students participate in any of the following school-related activities? And answer 6 was participate in parent council, parent association, or school management committee. And the trend is that participation of parents of migrant students in the parent council, parent association, or school management committee influence the amount of culturally responsible practices that schools realize. And the tendency that we saw during analyzing the next questions are really close. The next one, please. And the question 21.1 was, to what extent do the following statements reflect the situation in your school? And the trend was that the support of the majority of parents and community members of the efforts of multicultural education in school influenced the amount of cultural responsible experience by school. The next slide, please. The next question was, to what extent do the following statements reflect the situation in your school? And there were several answers: school staff, colleagues, parents, students, general public, and government. And we have strongest correlation in this question. The strongest correlation was between school staff and students. So school staff and the students has the most influence. And the trend that we have found, this means that the support provided by the principal, colleagues, school board, parents, and students are significant for the cultural responsible practice implementation in schools, while the support from general public of government have no influence. We didn't find the correlation here. They didn't have the influence of the cultural responsible practices that school realize. So talking about this correlation of these several questions that I have just shown, we have found the strongest correlation between the parents' attitude to diversity at school, parents' participation, and school staff support and student attitude to the migrant children studying in schools and the practices that schools realize. Thank you, Natalia, please.
Yes, thank you, Daria. And I will just give a short conclusion regarding the further research. Well, as we see it, we need to select those trends that can be actually influenced by conducting trainings or professional development programs. And well, today, Daria mentioned 3 of them, which is engagement of parents, support from the school community, and leadership behavior. And our next step will be design and delivery of professional development programs to improve the competencies of teachers and school leaders, as well as ways to engage parents and members of the school community in the school life. And that will be all from our side. Thank you for listening. And I suggest that we move on to discussing the results of the findings that we just presented. Yes, well, so many hands. I don't know who. Well, Herbert, can you start, please?
Actually, that was no question. That was just applause for your
I'm sorry.
presentation.
I thought it was a raised hand.
Well, should I start without raising the hand?
Yes, please.
Yeah, so I just think that the first point before we discuss the findings, I think it will be interesting to discuss the sample we really had. And as Natalia mentioned in her presentation, so the number of responses we get was not that big that we expected. And I would like to propose to talk first about the origin of the sample. I think that we had the national sample actually only in Ireland, and in Russia, for example, that was the sample which was focused in two cities, quite big cities, Moscow first, and then Samara, and which is another big city, an old city which situated in Volga River. But anyway, it's not that huge megapolis as Moscow is. And so we actually find that of course there were some COVID limitations when we started the project, and that's why we had to do our interviews in distance, for example. But from another hand, I think that one of the reasons that we had less responses as we expected was that it is quite, from one hand, it's quite complicated question to discuss for the head teachers, and from another hand, as a hypothesis, maybe you will support it or break it down. I mean that probably that there is some, we were faced with some phenomena of escaping. You know, so as we know that it is really a complex question. Sometimes we try to better deny it than to start going deeper. At least I have this kind of feeling, and please share your ideas, your experience, and your hypothesis about sample. And I think that for our people who attend us in YouTube, it will be interesting to know a bit more about the origin of sample. And yeah, I would propose to share the ideas about that.
Yes, please, Herbert.
Yes, as to the Austrian sample, we sampled all the lower secondary school leaders in two regions. The one was the metropolitan region of Vienna, so it is a fully city region, and the other one was the province of Upper Austria. And our response rate was 50%, which looks good in comparison to other countries, but it is actually worse than we had in previous studies. So maybe Igor is right in that the content of the question is also difficult in many respects. One respect is the knowledge of school leaders and teachers themselves. So because maybe there's also a big diversity with respect to knowledge about cultural responsivity. On the other hand, I would say it is a tricky question in many schools for the staff interaction. So that there's a big diversity among staff how to cope with this aspect. But certainly the times of COVID pandemic also put additional pressure on all the school leaders. So this is one aspect which one could understand, that sometimes they felt more comfortable with not answering this questionnaire.
Could I just comment, maybe expanding it a little beyond this project? One of the things we've noticed over an extended period is the reluctance of a lot of school leaders or teachers in general to take part in research. And particularly in a situation where it's not mandated, it's voluntary, you're asking people to give their time, there's an increasing reluctance to give that time. And part of it may be tied into the change in the way we think of education and the role that research plays in education, that there's a lot of research now happening. Every single teacher in Ireland does a master's degree with some sort of research element. So schools are inundated with requests for people to undertake surveys, to engage in research, to do this. And I wonder if we're hitting a critical mass. I wonder if we're hitting a point where just the vast majority of them are ignored because there's so much of it coming in. And I think it almost beyond the confines of this project, taking your question, Igor, about sampling for a wider audience, I think this is going to be a big challenge for us as we go forward doing educational research in coming years. On the one side, we legitimately want to embed the idea of a research-led profession with research active educators. But on the other side, every single one of them is fishing in the same data pool, and the capacity to generate that is quite complicated. So.
I suppose I'll talk about that, taking up on what Joe was talking about sample sizes in educational research. Austria focused on two regions, and that was actually very wise, because what we did in Ireland was we carried out, because of this, our country, we only have a total of 750, roughly 750 secondary schools in Ireland. So in comparison to, for example, Russia, we have a limited pool as such, and indeed in Spain. But and what we did was we sent a survey out to every post-primary secondary schools, it is called in most jurisdictions, once, twice, and 3 times. And unlike Austria, so we sampled every school, or we didn't do a sample at all, we carried out a survey, a national survey. And our sample size was actually nowhere near that of Austria's, which was, I think, Herbert, you mentioned more than, Barbara, was it more than 50%, was it? Yeah. Well, our sample size on our third attempt was only about 12 to 13%. So it was very, very, very low indeed. And that was despite constant pleas and politenesses, etc. So I think actually, and with these schools, in Ireland, we have different school types. We have secondary schools. We have what are called educated. Secondary schools normally have a patron body from a religious order. We have educate together schools that are as such the up-and-coming multiculturally diverse school types. And we have what are referred to as community comprehensive schools. And on top of this, 7% of the schools in Ireland are what are referred to as private schools. So you can see with the different patron bodies and the different school types, and back to Barbara's point, you will have many, many different interpretations from the different school types based on the populations. I'll give you one example. We went into a private school and we talked about the challenges for culturally diverse students in their schools. And the private school said, our challenge is to get more students from migration backgrounds because they pay a lot of money. And so that's our challenge. We then went into another jurisdiction in an urban area where we have a high proportion of students, refugees, a lot of people with et cetera, that need an awful lot of help and support. And when we talked to them, they said, what do you need? We need more support, we need more support, we need more, et cetera, okay? Linguistic diversity, et cetera. So it will be interesting to look at the diversity of the results, massively interesting. And actually what we really found was, without taking away from Austria leading the case studies, when we do in our next symposium, and you're all invited, you will see the diversity of responses from leaders. And one can understand why, because of all of this policy enactment that is played out across the spectrum of education. But unfortunately, we got nowhere near the sample, the response rate that our Austrian and indeed our colleagues from Russia got. We don't have colleagues from Spain here today, but they actually followed a proportionate sampling strategy as well. And their response rate was also much so akin to Ireland. It was about 11% as well. So it will be interesting to see what comes out of the actual results. So that's all I have to say on that.
May I comment only very shortly on Martin? I think that Austria has the advantage that there was not until now so much research, because I think in Ireland, because of the structural features that Joe highlighted, we just begin with the master students that they have to do empirical work for their master thesis. It's the first year actually where I teach, where they do it. So, and already now I hear that the administration says, well, we don't want research about racism and discrimination in school. Go to the youth center. Then there it's better when you do the research. So we have a different situation, because we only start with research in schools, really, in that on that scale, as you mentioned.
Yeah. So it might be the end of quantitative research methods moving forward if we have all of these multiple surveys. So it would be very good for those who are proponents of qualitative research. The danger is, of course, if we go down that route, what quantitative analysis do we have? We have large-scale data sets that are used by transnational organizations, which are very good, and they've achieved an awful lot in Ireland. But yeah, it's what Joe brought up. It's a major issue moving forward methodologically. To be honest, yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah.
Can I ask something?
Yes, Herbert, please.
Actually, I don't want to argue against your arguments about too many surveys in the schools. So I think that's quite valid. And that is a task maybe also for national research associations, how to coordinate research. And also, as Barbara said, I think it makes sense to introduce students into empirical research, but it doesn't make sense that every individual student goes into school. So, but I wanted to just to highlight this other argument which Igor also raised. I think to ask school leaders about cultural diversity may be a difficult question for them. And just wanted to share findings from our previous project, where also Dublin City University had the lead, that was cultural responsive assessment. And when we did interviews with teachers and school leaders in schools, we were surprised how hesitant they were in using the term culture, because in public discourse, in pubs, you feel that everybody is talking about that cultural diversity is increasing. When we were talking to school teachers and school leaders, they very rarely talked about cultural differences, but much more often they talked about language, different languages, lack of language. And one interpretation was it is easier to talk about language because it's a more clear concept, and they feel uneasy if they are in a more profound discussion, really to talk about cultural differences. That is maybe a term you use more lightly if you're talking in a restaurant to your friends than you talk in a more professional discourse, which may be an indication for also that we are lacking in the school system professional knowledge with respect to cultural diversity. So that might be an idea. Yeah.
Well, dear colleagues, if I may add regarding the data samples. Well, of course, they were not as high as we hoped for, but still we have the data we have. And returning back to the actual data analysis that Daria just explained, would you like to comment on that? Because we actually, there was a very massive work, and we actually, hesitated a little bit when choosing the research methods. And finally, when we decided upon the research methods, we would like to have your feedback if, it's possible within the framework of this mini-symposium. Yes, please, Barbara.
Yeah, thank you for presenting the first results. I was wondering if we should think about the direction of effects when we talk about parent engagement or participation in school, because as you can see in the concepts, it is seen as the task of a culturally responsive school leader to involve parents, to communicate in a linguistically and culturally responsive way with parents. And it's not that the parents have to, so to say, try to reach the school leader, but the school leader has first try to reach in the adequate way parents, communities. And when I talk about this, of course, I have this background from Austria. I don't know about the other countries really, but I would say in Austria, it's not at all, so that school leaders see themselves as agents to invite in a linguistically and culturally responsive way parents into their schools, because it's still more an authoritarian, they should behave like I expect them. And why don't they understand German? Now we have to organize a translator. It is so much work. And really, yes. I mean, I would not support an explanation where we would write a school leader is more culturally responsive when parents are more engaged in the school. You understand what I mean?
Yes, Barbara. This is, yes, I totally understand. And actually, this is, a debatable point. And this is why we decided to put it on the slide, because this is the trend that we found, actually. And the linear regressions, they show it for all 4 countries, that, the more parents are engaged, the more parents of migrant students are engaged in the school life, the more culturally responsive practices are actually implemented in schools. Maybe Daria will comment on that in more detail.
Thank you, Barbara, for the question. I agree with Natalia here. Yes, that at the slide we just showed the trend that gave us the statistical analysis. But I understand and I agree with Barbara that how the parents are engaged depends on their principal work. And so it's maybe the result of the principal work that parents are engaged and they support maybe the principals has principles explained and they edited. And very interesting finding that Herbert also commented about the language. When we analyze Russia and the questions of that were connected with the language, for example, additional classes of Russian language and so, and our director was now as polite and correct as the questions about the diversity when they talked about language, really. For example, when they talk about diverse, they answered more positive about that we should support. It's very, very important. But when there was a question about should there be additional classes in their native language or so, the answer was that no, they should learn Russian. All the classes should be in Russian. So this tendency we saw in our sample also. It was highly interesting. So I agree with this idea.
I also would like to add that, of course, due to this statistical analysis we can't build really cause and effect conclusions. But I think that this first we may state that the parents' involvement is important anyway. And maybe to go more deeply to this phenomena, because I agree with Barbara when she mentioned that this is like a teacher's task to involve parents. But from another hand, we know phenomena when we have, for example, quite big communities in some place which perform like being interested in education and which and that step into the school might be their initiatives. So actually, I think maybe we have to analyze at least some cases to know how it really happens. That it really head teachers effect of head teachers performing or actions. And or it's the national community initiatives which are like more intensive, let's say this way, thinking about, because I know at least some a lot of phenomena when some communities value education a lot and they just may invest a lot to make the kids more integrated and getting better education in the country than when they now. So I think that we may analyze it more specifically.
Yeah, actually, that's back to that project that Herbert was talking about, a previous project. There was this conception and notion of what might be referred to as intercultural community evaluation and planning to engage communities more with what actually happens in the school grounds. So I think that merits an awful lot of work with what you're saying, Igor. So yeah, it'd be interesting to move down to. There's Sarah has her hand up. I think it's not Sarah.
Yeah, the interesting thing is I refer to what Igor said about school leaders' response towards cultural responsivity. The interesting thing is that most of them, they say that for us, when children come to school, they're all alike. So the important point is for them to realize the cultural differences. So I refer to our framework, conceptual framework, that it has to be cultural responsivity means inclusivity. It has to be inclusive because the instruction is culturally responsive. But the question is that to which culture it is oriented currently. So we all know that instruction is responsive to the dominant culture. The school leaders have to realize this, that it is responsive to the dominant culture only. So they have to include the minority cultures into their day-to-day teaching. So when we ask them that, how are you responsive to different cultures in your school? In which subjects are you including different cultures in your instructions? So they talk about religion, they talk about history, but they don't realize that in every subject, in every class, and outside the class, they have to be responsive to the variety of cultures in their schools. Yeah.
Do we have any more comments or suggestions?
Maybe a quick reaction to Sarah, because I fully support what she says. The difficult thing is they don't have any idea oftentimes how this could work, because they didn't participate in any training. They really lack the self-reflexivity, I can say that for Austria, to a large part, because they never conceptualized themselves as being part of a majority, a specific cultural group, which is the norm, and a specific religious background, and so on and so forth. They never imagined themselves. They're just the norm. They're just normal. And that is all. And as long as you don't dig deep into that question of identity, belonging, and culture, they have no idea. They think they are very nice to everyone, and that's it, so to say.
But just to jump in on that, just for 1 second, I think doesn't that go back to Herbert's point of earlier on, why maybe these issues of identity and culture are discussed more easily in the pub or the restaurant, because it's a less formal environment. If you start digging deep to these core questions of identity in a school setting, with its interactions with policy and national identity and school identity, it's a very, very, very complex area. And I think the more, I mean, as Herbert has said, this is the second or third or maybe even the fourth project we've worked on in this general area. And the more you get into it, the more we realize the underpinning cultural and political fault lines that are there. And as we move forward with this type of research, I think it's going to become an increasing challenge, particularly because culture and identity have become so mixed up with contemporary political movements. And I think that's going to be a major challenge as we address this, because some people will be fundamentally opposed to the conception that we're putting forward here. And that's a challenge for any research.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, thank you, Joe. So I just checked the live chat, and it seems that there are no questions at the moment. So if, well, at least on my version of YouTube. So if, I don't know, if there are no more comments or, well, suggestions or points of discussions, what do you think, Igor? Yes, please, Barbara.
If we still have time, I want to add something.
Actually 10 minutes that we still have.
Wonderful. Because when doing the research about existing concepts, it is obviously very embedded already in the discourse in the US and Canada, because you find the ministries like the Ontario Ministry of Education who put forward, we want the educators to be like this, self-reflective and this and that and this and that, culturally responsive, deep knowledge of their students' life worlds and so on and so forth. So, I mean, we do have jurisdictions in this world where even policymakers dare to put it forward as the norm, what they really want to achieve, which would be difficult in Austria at the moment, I think. But however, this gives me some hope. Also in the US, like I think 50 states out of the 52, how many they have, they have it in their teaching standards. So it's not, I'm aware of the fact that it's not implemented, of course, in every school and so on, but the step to have it as a norm in the discourse of the profession is a very important step. We're not there. In Austria, we're not there, definitely not. I'm struggling a lot about that with all kinds of actors. I don't know about Ireland, maybe you're at a different point.
Well, Ireland, no, in agreement. I mean, we're very good at making policies and policy implementation again and again. But we're not very good at policy enactment. And also at times, because of the various school types and the various people in the system. And also at times, I think we might try to do too much. If you look at the teacher education standards in Ireland, we talk about this conception of inclusivity, inclusive classrooms, and the whole banner of cultural responsivity, special education needs, etc., is encapsulated as one term. So in actual fact, probably we do too much in Ireland. And I know our colleagues from Austria know more about this. When the PISA test scores in Ireland, we didn't do so well, to say the least. And we focused on literacy and numeracy. And now we're doing well, shall we say. Maybe there's another reason why we're doing well. But anyway, we focused on literacy and numeracy. Other jurisdictions focused on change, not in relation to literacy and numeracy, but our colleagues from Austria might discuss it more with me. In Denmark, in teacher education, they specifically focused on integration, migration background students, etc. So in many ways, the system we have is the system we actually get from our people that are responsible for implementing all of this legislation as well. So priorities, of course, are an issue as well. The case of Denmark, focus was on migration background students in teacher education. In Ireland, we focused on actually everything, everything really, and maybe too much. Yeah.
I would like to do some other addition to our conversation, responding to the previous remark from Barbara about the education, that nobody taught the head teachers how to react, how to act in the multicultural community. And actually, this is one of the topics of our project, and we had this kind of questions in the questionnaire that we used. But I think that this is also another point to go deeper. I don't know if we will manage in this very project, or it's behind it. That actually to analyze what is the content of that kind of courses at the university or in service training, because at least sometimes when some topics is very socially sharp or like some kind in fashion, so the schools and universities start producing the courses and classes which are devoted to this topic, or actually or at least mentioning the concepts in the names. But sometimes behind those titles should be really different content. So maybe the other way and the other direction of analysis will be somehow to analyze what was the real content of those classes, what those head teachers who attended the classes at some moment of their career, what they really get from those classes. So just this analysis would be very useful.
I fully agree, Igor, and I really live it by myself, I must tell you, because I see the title of the course from some colleagues, and I ask, what are you doing there? And they say, well, we talk about heterogeneity, about the different talents that students have in mathematics and so on. And the title of the course is Diversity, Teaching and Learning in Diversity. And they never mention migration at all, even no multilingualism. It's not the topic, and religiosity, multiple, no topic, never mentioned. So I'm really wondering, what is this term, diversity? I mean, you would think that when you talk about diversity in Austrian schools, as we have now in primary school, close to 30% multilingual students on average, yeah, you would think that they are interested in linguistic diversity. But the teachers in education, I mean, the university teachers, they don't know about it, and they cannot talk about it. And they have to talk about diversity, but they talk about something else. So this is my lived experience. Yeah.
So it looks like we are raising more questions than proposing answers at the moment. But
very important, I think.
We have another year.
Yeah.
Well, our time is finishing, dear colleagues. So I think that was very fruitful and very interesting discussion. And I hope that we will proceed with answering these questions raised today. And I hope we will at least find some part of solution of them.